When the summer heat ignited, a stepmother's unexpected passion. It was the beginning of summer, and the humidity hung heavy in the air, making everything feel like it was simmering just below the surface. I was spending some time at my dad's place, a sprawling ranch out in the country that was always a welcome respite from the city's frenetic energy. I'd just wrapped up my second year of college, and I desperately needed a break, a chance to catch my breath and slow down. My dad's place was always that haven. I am 20 now, and the days were usually long and lazy, spent messing around in the garage tinkering with my bike, the smell of oil and metal a strange comfort. My life was changing, and now I live with my dad after he remarried to Linda, a woman who was almost 3 times my age. She was cool, a free spirit with this quiet confidence that made it hard to look away, but nothing more than that. I'd always seen her as this beautiful, untouchable figure, someone who had just stepped into my dad's world, but never a part of mine. My dad was happy with her. They always looked happy together, and I was grateful for the sense of calm she brought into our family. But that was as far as I let my mind go. That morning, I was wrenching on the stubborn chain of my bike, my muscles flexing and stretching with every turn, when the back door from the house swung open and a familiar, smoky voice drifted through. It was Linda, and that voice, like it always had, sent a rush of sensation through me, a strange mix of longing and something I wasn't ready to name. "Hey you," she said, and that voice, which had been so soothing to me for so long now, it felt like a caress against my skin. "You spending all your time out here?" I glanced up, the wrench in my hand suddenly seeming too heavy, my breath catching in my throat, and my heart skipping a beat. Linda was leaning against the doorframe, a vision of effortless elegance, her long, pale hair framing a face that I could never not stare at. She was wearing this loose, flowy dress that clung to her body, hinting at the curves underneath. She wasn't just my stepmom, she was a force of nature, a captivating presence that filled the space around her with an undeniable pull. And I had been trying so hard to ignore it all, trying to tell myself that she was only ever my dad's wife. "Yeah," I mumbled, trying to keep my voice casual. "Bike stuff." I shifted uncomfortably as a wave of awareness swept over me, a realization of how truly attractive and desirable I'd come to see her. And in that moment, I knew that there was a part of me, the part I had tried to keep hidden, had finally began to awake. "I used to spend hours in here when I was younger." She crossed her arms, and I watched her, suddenly mesmerized, as that dress seemed to shift with every move, revealing her body in ways that made me burn from within. It was like a sanctuary. "Guess it's kind of the same for me," I replied, letting my gaze linger, wanting, needing to stare for one moment longer. She stepped closer, her eyes searching mine, a subtle dance of attraction that seemed both playful and serious. "So, what are you working on?" she asked, and this time, there was an intensity in her gaze that made my breath catch in my throat. "Nothing important," I muttered, struggling to maintain an easy tone, my hand tightening around the wrench in my hand, wanting to use that strength to reach out, to touch her, to feel the heat of her body against mine. "Oh, I am sure it's important," she said, and she leaned in closer, her lips just an inch away from mine, her voice barely a murmur that set my skin tingling. The line between us had just been blurred, and now all my control was about to break. Every dream is important, right? And that was it. All the control, the restraint, the politeness, it faded away, and it was only then, in that space, that I finally let myself think that maybe she was feeling it too. It all started there, in the old beat-up garage, and it all happened fast. I started finding reasons to be closer to her, to touch her, or to just let myself get lost in her gaze. She became my secret, my muse, the one person I found myself thinking about when I was alone, and every single moment I spent near her was one I was forced to relive over and over. I had been forced to suppress all the desire I felt, and as time went on, I could feel the dam start to break. The unspoken had become an undercurrent that rippled between us like a fire, and it was slowly consuming us both. That following week, I was putting away tools when I found myself searching for her, needing her presence. When I saw her, standing on the porch, looking out over the fields, her figure silhouetted against the sunset, the longing swelled within me with so much force, I was left breathless. "Hey," I said, walking toward her, my voice low, raspy. "Need some help?" She turned, and her eyes were a smoky green, a storm that I could feel pulling me in, and there was a warmth that reached all the way through me. "Just enjoying the sunset, Chris," she replied, her tone softer than it had been earlier, and her hand, with a mind of its own, came to brush against my jaw. There was no turning back. We had crossed a point of no return, and it was then, with the sky ablaze around us, I knew that this was something we could no longer ignore. We didn't say anything for a moment, and then we both said what was in both of our hearts. "I don't understand this," I admitted, my voice cracking, the fear finally surfacing from within. "You don't have to," she replied, her hand lingering on my jaw and her touch sent waves of heat through my body. "Just feel it, Chris." Our lips met for the first time, and it was a fire, it was a desire, it was a surrender. And in that moment, I realized that she had always been so much more than just my stepmother. I had tried to define it away. I had spent years trying to suppress the burning that had always simmered, but now, as she held me tight against her, I knew that what was happening was meant to be. It was an undeniable truth. I was drawn to her like a moth to a flame, and she held the map, she held the answers, and all I wanted was to be lost within her grasp. That night, the air was thick with unspoken desires, and every touch was a promise of more. There was no pretense now, no rules, no boundaries, and we spent that night exploring a forbidden love that was both electrifying and completely intoxicating. We woke up the next morning entangled in each other's arms, both of us changed by the experience, by the passion that was now flowing between us like the waves of the sea. There was nothing that we could do to stop it now. We had crossed the line, and the only thing left to do was fall. Over the following weeks, our connection deepened. We would steal kisses in the kitchen, our bodies brushing as if they were magnets. We would share whispered confessions in the living room, and the house seemed to buzz with the energy of our forbidden love, and every single touch made me ache for more. There was passion, there was hunger, and there was a love that had grown from a seed that had been planted long ago. One evening, as the moon shone brightly through the windows, I found myself staring at Claire, at the way her skin seemed to glow beneath the moonlight. She caught my eye, and she smiled, a slow, sensual curve of her lips, and the world around me stopped. "What are you thinking?" she murmured, and her voice was like a warm caress against my skin. I breathed in and spoke from the heart, that you are more beautiful than anything I have ever known, and all I want is to keep you close. She came to me, like she knew she was being called, and she closed the gap between us, and with every single kiss, I found myself falling deeper into the endless ocean of what she made me feel. Her lips were warm, her hands were like fire, her body, a canvas that I needed to explore. "You are a dangerous man, Chris," she said, and that whisper made my skin tingle. Her eyes held a knowing that both challenged and pulled me to her. "And you, my dear," I replied, and my hand came to touch her, to map the curve of her neck, the strong line of her jaw, the way that her skin seemed to call to me. "You are my favorite kind of trouble." But our time together was soon coming to a close. The last days of summer were upon us, and soon I would return to college, and that knowledge hung over me like a storm cloud that was about to burst. The last night was a slow burn of unspoken feelings, of promises we were making without ever saying a word, and of an ache that I could feel in my soul. I held her close, memorizing every touch, every curve, every line of her face, because I knew that I might never be so close again. The morning arrived with all its cruelty. The sky was a mournful gray, the air heavy with the knowledge that our time was coming to an end. And as I watched Linda walk into the kitchen, I knew it was time for her to break the quiet, Time for her to say those words that had been dancing on the tip of her tongue for so long now. She met my gaze in her eyes. They were calm, but they held a storm, a promise that I knew I couldn't ignore. "Chris," she whispered, and she crossed the distance between us, stepping closer with every single word. "I can't pretend anymore. I need you to know that this is real, that you are real." "I know," I replied. "And I need to know what this all means to you?" she murmured, and I was lost. There was no turning back, and as our eyes locked and our hands connected, I knew there was only one answer. "You are everything to me," I whispered. Our lips met again, and this time there was no hesitant. It was a kiss that made the world fall away, and I knew, as her body pressed against mine, that we could no longer ignore it. This was our fate, and whatever happened in the future, it would be something we chose together. We spent the rest of the day close, our bodies always touching, always connecting, and we surrendered to the knowledge that our journey had only just begun. That evening, I was lying on my bed when my dad called out to me. "Chris," he said, and I could hear the joy in his voice. "Come on down, dinner's ready." I smiled to myself and took a deep breath. As I rose from the bed and made my way down the stairs, I met Linda's gaze, and she had become a part of me, the best part, the part of me that made me alive. I met my father at the bottom of the stairs, and a strange sensation washed over me. I could smell the dinner that he had prepared, the familiar sense of home, and it felt as though I was seeing everything through new eyes. It was like the world, it had shifted, and this woman, my stepmother, she was now a part of everything I did. She was the fire that made me alive, and I was the one to keep the embers burning. That night, we had dinner, and all was polite, all was formal, but I knew that it was not for long. I looked at Linda as we ate, and I found myself getting lost in her gaze and her smile. It was like the promise of a storm that would break the chains of this charade and set us both free. After dinner, I headed out to the porch, and she came to me, a storm raging behind her eyes. "Chris," she whispered, and her words carried a hint of warning, a promise that our secret would not stay buried for long. "What is this? What do you want?" I reached out and cupped her cheek. It felt like the most natural thing, to touch her, to be near her. And my answer came from deep within, from a part of me I hadn't even known existed before I had met her. "You. It's always been you," I confessed, and in that instant, I accepted what was in my heart and what had become the most undeniable truth. I wanted Linda Montgomery with every ounce of my being. She stepped closer, and I felt her body press against mine. "Then let's," she said, her voice a mere whisper, a siren's call that pulled me to the edge. "Let's do it all." I laughed. "It seems it has always been our fate," I replied. Her lips found mine, and in that moment, I let everything go. And all that I had tried to fight, it was a raging fire within me. We kissed, we touched, and we fell again, deeper and harder into a love that had grown from a small seed of attraction into an all-consuming forest fire. Our love was messy, complicated, forbidden, and yet it was the most beautiful thing that had happened to me. I was no longer just a stepson. I was a man who had fallen for a woman who was so much more than he had ever imagined. A woman who had become the one thing he needed to make his world complete. What we had wasn't just a fling, it wasn't a passing whim. It was a connection that had taken root in the most unexpected of circumstances, and I was ready to see it all through. That night, as we went our separate ways, I caught her looking at me, her eyes shining with an intensity that matched my own. I would get through this night, I would get through tomorrow, and then I would claim her as mine, forever. I woke up the next morning, and a familiar routine called to me. I made my coffee, I did my stretches, I watered my garden, and I waited. And then, she came to me. "I am ready, Chris," she said. Her voice was husky and rough from sleep, but her eyes held a strength and a fire that made my heart leap with desire. "What are we going to do now?" I smiled, and my hand, as if it had a mind of its own, went to find her waist. "We are going to live," I said, my voice filled with a newfound confidence. "We are going to love." She came to me, and I knew that this was it. And as our lips met and our bodies joined, I knew that my life, it would never be the same again.